My name is Jonathan Pierce. I've spent most of my life in cities, places where light never really dies, and noise is the background hum that keeps you from hearing yourself think. So when the department called about the body found deep in Hollow Trail Forest, I took the case almost out of stubbornness. A man alone in the woods, they said. No signs of struggle. No tracks leading in or out. Just gone quiet. They told me the report came from a pair of hikers. Said they found his camp still warm, the tent zipped from the inside, the fire barely smoldering. But by the time rangers arrived, there was nothing, no man, no footprints, just a hollow in the soil where something heavy had been. The trail was 2 hours north of Ash Vale, unmarked and narrow enough that the road map didn't bother showing it. I parked where the asphalt ended and followed what was left of a service path, the kind old park trucks used decades ago. The forest pressed in on both sides, dark pine trunks, heavy moss, air thick with resin and moisture. I could hear water somewhere nearby, not a river, but a constant slow drip, like the woods were leaking. After about an hour, I reached the clearing the rangers described. It wasn't large, a small ring of earth surrounded by trees that seemed to bend toward the center, their branches heavy, black with rain. The ground was flattened where the tent must have stood. No ash in the fire pit, only damp stone and soil. No tools, no food wrappers. Whoever had been here had taken everything, or something had taken them. I walked the perimeter, scanning for prints, broken branches, anything. The mud was smooth. No animal tracks, no human steps. Only one thing broke the pattern. A single indentation, circular, deep, as if someone had set a heavy object there and left it overnight. When I pressed my palm against it, the dirt was colder than the surrounding ground. Near the base of a tree, I found something else, a notebook. Soaked, the ink mostly bled into the pages, but the first few lines were still visible. Second night. Heard movement near the ridge. Thought it was wind, but the trees don't move the same way here. They bend with the sound. The handwriting stopped there. The rest of the page was smudged into gray. The sun was already low by the time I finished the site sketch. Light in the forest doesn't fade, it thins, like water leaking through cracks. By dusk, the shadows had dissolved into a single color, the air metallic and cold. I followed what might have been a trail uphill, though the trees grew so close together that it felt less like a path and more like a throat closing around me. Every branch seemed to point inward. And beneath the soil, I could hear faint shifting, roots, maybe, or something heavier moving just below the surface. The sound stopped when I did. At the ridge, I found what might have been the man's vantage point, a small lookout above a valley drowned in fog. From here, the forest floor looked almost liquid, waves of mist rolling between trees, their tips like dark islands. The air carried a strange rhythm, almost like breathing, the slow expansion and collapse of fog. I stayed there until my flashlight began to dim. On the way back down, I noticed something I'd missed before, carvings in the bark of several trees. Not initials or symbols. Just lines. Short vertical cuts in repeating sets of 5, low to the ground, like someone marking days. There were hundreds of them, wrapping the trunks in rough spirals. The last set stopped abruptly, halfway around a tree, as though the hand that made them had been pulled away mid-motion. I returned to the clearing just as the night took hold. The forest was soundless now. Even the dripping had stopped. The air had that strange, suspended weight, not quiet, but expectant. I unpacked my gear, sat by the cold fire ring, and made my notes. Every now and then I thought I saw movement beyond the tree line, not shapes, just light bending differently between trunks. Like the forest was breathing again. When I looked down at the notebook, the damp ink on the last visible line had blurred further, bleeding into the page. But the indentation of new words had appeared below it, pressed into the paper, no ink at all. If you stop writing, it listens closer. I didn't sleep. Not for lack of trying, the body was tired, but the mind kept replaying that single line pressed into the notebook. If you stop writing, it listens closer. By morning, my camp looked different. The trees around the clearing had shifted, or maybe it was just the light. Pines that stood apart last night now leaned toward the center, their needles thick and heavy, glistening with dew that didn't drip. The air had that electric quiet, like the second before thunder. I poured cold coffee from my flask, tore a piece of bread, and sat near the remnants of the fire pit. The soil inside the ring was still darker than the rest of the ground, not ash, but something like wet charcoal, packed and smooth. When I prodded it with my boot, the surface sank slightly, soft as if it hadn't cooled yet. I wrote my morning notes quickly, forcing words to fill the page just to break the silence. Every few sentences, I'd stop, lift my head, listen. Nothing. But nothing itself had texture here, a sound that wasn't quite absence but pressure, wrapping around you like mist. I decided to move north along the ridge. The ranger report mentioned that the missing camper had been seen in that direction 2 days before he vanished. Some hikers claimed they heard hammering in the distance, like someone driving stakes into the ground. No one checked it then. The climb wasn't steep, but the terrain was unstable. Roots surfaced from the earth like veins slick with moss. At one point I slipped and caught myself on a low branch. The bark cracked under my hand, and I saw the same markings as before. 5 short vertical lines, neat and deliberate. But this time, the grooves were fresh. Sap still glistened in the cuts, sticky and yellow, catching the light like glass. I brushed my fingers against one of them, warm. Further up, the forest thinned slightly. Here, between the trees, I found an old structure, what was left of a wooden cabin, half collapsed and eaten by rot. It couldn't have been part of any modern map. It looked pre-war, maybe older. The roof had caved in, and a massive pine had grown straight through what used to be the living space. The wood smelled of decay, the kind that lives longer than people. Inside, there was almost nothing left, just the remnants of a table, a rusted lantern, and something that might have been a cot. But near the back wall, carved deep into the timber, were hundreds of the same tally marks, packed so tightly they almost formed a pattern. Each set of 5 was slightly misaligned from the last, spiraling upward like someone marking the passage of something that didn't stop. I ran my hand along them. At one point the pattern broke. A space the size of a human hand had been left blank. Below it, carved deeper than any other line, was a single word. Listen. I stepped outside, my breath fogging in the cool air. The forest around the cabin was utterly still. Not even the wind moved. And then I heard it, a faint hum, low and rhythmic, pulsing through the ground. It wasn't mechanical. It sounded alive. Like something large exhaling just below the surface. I crouched, pressed my palm against the earth. The vibration was faint but steady, almost like a heartbeat. And beneath it, I thought I could hear something else, the soft scrape of movement, like hands brushing through soil. The hum grew stronger when I faced east. I followed it, moving carefully through the undergrowth. As I went, I noticed the trees began to change, bark peeling away in strips, sap running thick and dark like blood. The ground became softer underfoot. Then I saw them. A cluster of mounds rose from the forest floor, arranged in a near-perfect circle. Each was covered in a layer of pale moss, the kind that only grows where sunlight never reaches. And in the center of the ring, a large hole, maybe 6 feet wide, perfectly round, too smooth to be natural. The hum came from there. It echoed upward like wind moving through a hollow throat. When I leaned closer, I could feel warmth on my face, as if the earth was breathing out. I threw a small stone in. It didn't hit bottom. No echo. Just the faint sound of something shifting far below, followed by silence so deep it made my ears ring. The hole wasn't new. The edges had hardened, compacted by time. But the moss around it had grown in spirals, radiating outward, the same shape as the marks carved in the trees and cabin walls. I took out my notebook and wrote quickly. The markings correspond to time or repetition. The sound follows no natural rhythm. Feels like the forest is timed to something unseen. Avoid standing still too long. When I looked back up, the light had shifted again. The sun, which had been directly overhead, now sat low behind the trees, too low for what felt like an hour's walk. My watch had stopped. I turned to retrace my steps, but the path behind me was gone. The cabin, the ridge, even the faint trail I'd followed here, nothing remained but trees, identical, spaced evenly apart. And then I saw something move across the clearing. Not an animal. Not even a person, really. Just a distortion, like the air bending in heat, but colder, sharper. It paused near the edge of the hole, then vanished downward, swallowed by the dark. I should have felt fear, but all I could feel was gravity, that slow pull toward the center, like the forest itself was leaning closer. I took one last note before I forced myself to leave. If it hums, don't stop. If it stops, start writing. When I turned to go, I realized I'd been standing there for longer than I thought. The sun had fully set. The hole wasn't making noise anymore. And the forest, it had begun to listen. The woods were not dark. That would have been easier. Darkness is honest. This was something else, a bruised twilight that hung between the trees and refused to move on. It wasn't night, but it wasn't morning either. I walked until my legs started to ache, following what I thought was a new path, thin, uneven, tangled with roots. But after 20 minutes I realized I was passing the same tree again. The same markings. 5 cuts, one longer than the rest, sap-dried black. I checked my compass. The needle spun twice, then froze, pointing north. When I turned, it didn't move. Even when I changed direction, it stayed locked. The air around me felt heavy, almost metallic, as if the forest were closing in. I started marking trees myself, small scratches with my knife, just to know where I'd been. 5 tallies for each turn. After a while, I came across one of my own marks, but the sap was already dry, the cuts sealed as if they'd been there for days. Something was wrong with time here. It didn't move forward, it looped. The fog came in shortly after that. Not rolling through the forest, but rising from it. It seeped upward between roots and rocks, low and thick like breath from the soil. It carried the faint smell of copper and rot, not decay, but something deeper, more lived in. I moved slowly, keeping my flashlight low. The beam caught glimpses, a boot print half filled with water, a torn piece of fabric snagged on bark, a rusted tin cup lying in a bed of moss. All human but old. Years old. I crouched to inspect the cup, and that's when I noticed something in the reflection of its dented surface. Behind me, faint, almost imperceptible, a figure standing between 2 trees. I turned. Nothing. Only the fog moving, slow and deliberate. But the air where it had stood was colder, as though something had been breathing there just moments before. I pressed on downhill now. I needed to reach the river. I'd heard it faintly in the morning, the slow, steady trickle somewhere east. Water meant direction. Civilization. Sound. But every few minutes that hum returned, the same low vibration I'd felt near the hole. It wasn't coming from below this time. It was around me. Sometimes it would shift, to my left, then right, then directly behind. When I stopped, it stopped. When I moved again, it resumed. It followed me like a second heartbeat, quiet but insistent. The notebook in my jacket felt heavy. I didn't want to look at it, but I could feel the moisture seeping through the pages, the faint impression of words that weren't mine. Still, I took it out, flipped to the back, and began to write. The sound is constant now. It mimics distance. I believe the forest remembers where we've walked. The moment the pen left the page, the hum paused, as if it was reading. I reached a ravine, a shallow cut through the land, filled with mist. The ground sloped downward sharply, the soil slick and soft. At the bottom, a small stream wound through the trees, black water sliding between stones. I knelt to take a closer look. The current was slow, unnaturally so, and beneath the surface I could see pale shapes drifting, round, smooth stones, each carved with 5 parallel lines. Hundreds of them. The markings were identical to those on the trees. When I touched one with my stick, it rolled slightly, revealing something I hadn't noticed. A faint indentation in the shape of a fingerprint. Human. It took me a moment to realize what they were. They weren't stones. They were bones, polished by water and time, marked like tally marks in the forest. The stream was moving too slow for that. It was carrying them back. I followed it for nearly half an hour until it disappeared into a narrow gap in the rock, like an open mouth. The hum grew stronger again, deeper now, resonant. When I leaned close to the opening, I could hear whispering. Not words exactly, just texture, like the sound of someone thinking too loudly. I should have turned back. Instead, I crouched and shone my light inside. The beam only reached a few feet before being swallowed by the black. But I could see the walls were covered in carvings, the same sets of lines, wrapping inward like the spirals on a fingerprint. And within one of them, a new symbol, a crude shape of a hand pressed into the stone, not carved, but burned in. The edges still glowed faintly, like embers under ash. I backed away, the hum fading behind me. My breath was visible now, though the air wasn't cold. It came out in short bursts, each one forming a small cloud that hung longer than it should. When I looked down at my own hands, I saw faint imprints along my skin, 5 parallel lines pressed into the flesh of my palm. I hadn't cut myself. The marks were just there. Not bleeding. Just remembered. I wrote one last note before I closed the book again. The forest does not lose people. It keeps them. And when it forgets, it replaces them. The fog was thicker now. I could barely see the ground in front of me. Each step sounded muffled, like the soil itself was swallowing the noise. I walked until I saw light ahead, faint, flickering. A fire. Someone else's camp, I thought. Relief, sudden and sharp. But as I drew closer, the shape by the fire didn't move. It sat perfectly still, back turned toward me, shoulders slightly hunched. When I circled around, careful not to make sound, I saw the truth. It wasn't a person at all. Just a hollow shell. A coat, boots, and a hat filled with earth, moss pushing up through the collar like hair. And in the dirt beside it lay another notebook. The last entry read, "If you write too long, it learns your hand." I closed my eyes, and the hum returned, steady, surrounding me. The forest wasn't listening anymore. It was reading. When I opened my eyes, the fire was still burning. Or at least, it looked like fire. The color was wrong. Not orange, not red, but a dull, trembling blue, like light trapped underwater. It gave no warmth. The air around it was cold enough that my breath fogged in thin ribbons that drifted toward the flame and disappeared. For a moment, I thought I'd actually fallen asleep, that the night before had folded into some fever dream. But the ground under me was real, wet, heavy, breathing in slow pulses that made my hands tremble when I touched it. The notebook was open beside me, pages curled from moisture. The last entry wasn't mine. He woke again. The forest wrote it first. The handwriting was uneven, but it was mine, or close enough to trick the eye. Same slant. Same loops. But I didn't remember writing it. I tried to stand. The moment I did, the hum started again, faint at first, then louder, vibrating through the soil. The fire flickered, its blue light brightening in time with the rhythm. Every pulse made the ground exhale thin curls of mist, like the forest itself was breathing through the dirt. The sound wasn't coming from below anymore. It was coming through me. Chest, spine, ribs, each vibration finding its way deeper, matching my heartbeat. I staggered back until my legs hit something solid. The shell, the coat and boots I'd seen before. But it wasn't hollow anymore. Soil had filled the chest cavity, compacted like clay. Thin, white shapes pushed up through the collar, finger bones, delicate and long, reaching toward the firelight. When I touched the coat's shoulder, the hum paused, as if waiting. Then the soil cracked, and air escaped in a low hiss. I ran. Branches snapped against my coat, damp needles clawing at my arms. The forest blurred, the fog tearing around me in slow motion. Every direction looked the same, every tree identical, every shadow already waiting for me before I arrived. The air carried whispers again, faint and fractured, like overlapping echoes. If it writes your name, you stop being a guest. I kept moving until I reached higher ground. There, through the trees, I saw faint light again, not fire this time, but daylight. It felt wrong, too clean, too bright. The forest ended abruptly. A clearing stretched ahead, grass flattened in rings, as if something massive had turned there. In the center stood a wooden sign, half-rotted and nearly swallowed by vines. Hollow Trail, EST 1947. Below it, another plank, newer, hammered crudely into the post. The letters burned in by hand. Closed until restored. But it wasn't the words that caught me. It was the object nailed just beneath the second plank. A notebook. The same brand as mine. I reached for it, hands trembling. It opened easily, pages damp but intact. Every line was written in my handwriting, precise, familiar, but the entries described things I hadn't yet seen. Fourth night. He still thinks the forest is reacting. He hasn't realized it's recording. The next page. He found the sign. He's reading this now. Don't stop. My pulse quickened. The hum returned, louder this time, not from the ground, but from the trees around the clearing. It rolled through the air like pressure, a low, droning sound that grew until the bark itself seemed to vibrate. I turned the page again. If you leave before it finishes, it writes without you. I slammed the notebook shut. The air stilled instantly, as if waiting for me to decide. Then I heard a sound behind me, paper tearing. I turned. My own notebook, the one I'd carried, had fallen open on the ground. Pages flipped in the windless air, moving fast, like hands unseen were searching for the right place. When they stopped, new ink began to appear, lines forming slowly across the page. He's still trying to leave. The letters bled outward, spreading like veins. Another line followed. It's almost done writing him. I tore the page out, but the words didn't stop. They appeared again on the next sheet, darker, pressing from the back as if written from underneath. My name began to form. J.N.A. I dropped the book and kicked it into the blue fire. It didn't burn. It sank, soundlessly, the pages curling but never blackening, as if the paper had been waiting for that. The hum faded. The clearing went silent again. I stood there, staring at the sign, the forest behind me breathing softly. Then I noticed the last thing, carved deep into the wood of the signpost, beneath everything else. Return to complete entry. And below that, barely visible under the rot, a single tally mark. Fresh. I backed away, step by step, until the trees swallowed the clearing. Behind me, I could hear the faint scratch of pen against paper, steady, deliberate. Not my hand. Not anymore. The forest had started writing again. I made it out. At least, that's what I told myself. The tree line broke just before dawn, and I stumbled into an empty road, wet asphalt gleaming under a thin layer of fog. The forest behind me ended cleanly, like someone had cut it with a blade. No gradual thinning of trees, no underbrush. Just a sharp line where life stopped being that forest and became ordinary again. My car was still there, parked exactly where I'd left it 3 days earlier. Only, it wasn't 3 days. The clock on the dashboard said 10 minutes had passed since I'd turned the ignition off. 10 minutes. That couldn't be right. But I didn't check twice. I just started the engine and drove. By the time I reached town, the sky was bleeding into morning. Asheville was quiet, shop windows fogged, streetlights flickering out one by one. It should have been comforting. It wasn't. Every reflection, in the glass, in the mirrors, even in the car's rearview, looked off. The angles were slightly wrong. The horizon bent just a little too much. Like the world I'd returned to was an imperfect copy, redrawn from memory. I stopped at the station, turned in my temporary case file. The clerk, a young woman I didn't recognize, flipped through the pages and frowned. "There's nothing in here," she said. I blinked. The folder was empty. No sketches. No notes. Not even the signature line at the bottom. The paper was clean, too clean. Like it had never been written on. I went home. Closed the blinds. Made coffee I didn't drink. And then I sat at my desk, staring at my hands. They looked normal, but when I flexed them, I could feel faint ridges under the skin, 5 parallel lines across each palm, pale as healed scars. On the shelf beside me lay my backup notebook, the one I keep for every case, a habit from years ago. I flipped it open. Blank. All except for one line, written neatly in the center of the first page. "Welcome back, Jonathan." The handwriting was mine. That night, I dreamed of the clearing again, the blue fire still burning, the hollow figure still sitting beside it. But this time, it was facing me. When it lifted its head, I saw my own eyes staring out of the soil. My voice, not quite right, whispered, "You left before it finished." I woke up to the sound of pen on paper. Slow. Deliberate. Coming from my desk. The backup notebook was open again, pages turning on their own. Fresh ink bled across the paper, each stroke forming words that curved slightly, as though being written by a hand too heavy to lift. "Fifth night. He thinks he's home." The next line appeared before I could move. "It doesn't matter where he goes. The forest writes wherever he stands." I tore the page out, but underneath it, the next one already bore new words. No ink, just indentations, pressed deep into the paper. "The trail doesn't end. It changes medium." The air in the room grew thicker. I could smell the woods again, pine, rot, damp soil. And under that, the faintest trace of smoke, cold, blue, impossible. I looked at my hands. They were clean. But when I turned them under the lamp, I saw dirt under the nails. I went to the sink, washed them until the skin went raw. Still, the smell wouldn't leave. The hum returned then, faint, distant, as if coming through the walls. The same pulse I'd felt beneath the earth. It matched the rhythm of the dripping faucet. One drop. Pause. Another drop. Then two. Then silence. I went still. And from the other room came the sound of another pen scratching paper. Not mine. The cadence was slower, patient, like it was waiting for me to listen. I followed it to the living room. The coffee table was covered in sheets of printer paper, each one filled with the same 5 marks, sets of tallies, repeating endlessly across the surface. As I watched, another line appeared, pressed from underneath. Then another. Then 5 more. The paper buckled from the pressure of invisible hands. I picked one up. The underside was damp. Smelled like pine. I didn't want to look, but I did. In the grain of the wood beneath the papers, carved faintly, were words. Fresh. Return to complete entry. The same phrase from the signpost. The letters gleamed wet under the light, as if the wood itself had just exhaled them. I tried burning the pages. They smoked but didn't catch. The air filled with that same faint blue shimmer I'd seen in the clearing. The hum grew louder, filling the walls, the ceiling, my lungs. Every window reflected the same image, not the room, but the forest. Endless trunks, fog drifting between them, moving in time with my breath. Then, for a brief moment, the reflections blinked. Not me. The room. The forest. And something deep in the glass moved closer. When I woke, if it was waking, it was daylight again. The hum was gone. The papers were clean. The desk was empty. On the table lay my badge, my watch, and the backup notebook. The cover was closed, but a single page stuck out slightly. I opened it. One line. The handwriting no longer mine. Hollow trail, case closed. And beneath it, faint, pressed into the papers so deeply it had torn. Entry complete. I stared at those words for a long time. Then I picked up my coat, locked the door, and stepped outside. The air was clear. The sky open. Everything was ordinary again. But as I walked to my car, I noticed the mud on the sidewalk, 5 short lines drawn by a stick, ending at my tire. When I looked up, the reflection in the car window didn't match my movements. It was still writing. And the hum, distant, buried, patient, began again beneath my feet. The forest never ends. It just waits for you to stop writing.